everyone. I'm Mariana,
I'm Anastasia.
and good morning, evening, night, wherever you may be located. Um, we are both content managers at Patreon, at the content moderation team at Patreon.
So if you're not familiar with Patreon, it's a platform where creators of all different kinds, whether they be podcasters, YouTubers, artists, photographers, can manage their memberships and interact with their super fans, which we call patrons. Patrons make it possible for creators to pursue creativity not just as a hobby, but as a legitimate career.
You're probably asking yourselves now, how does the content moderation team fit in all of this? So as you can imagine, because we send money to creators, we have to be mindful of the type of projects that we're funding for our platform. So we work with creators one-on-one to make sure that they're following our guidelines and that we keep Patreon a safe platform.
But Mariana, how did we end up at Patreon in the first place?
Well, long story short, as my educational background, I have studied international relations and later went for a master's in anthropology. And while I was doing my studies, I've also worked for other online platforms, such as Amazon and Airbnb as a contractor. And for the later, so for Airbnb, I was both a customer service representative for a certain time and later moved into the quality team, so as a quality analyst for more than 2 years and as a contractor as well. So I have a few insights about this experience as a contractor for a big company.
And as for myself, right after graduating college, I ended up in the trust and safety world by joining the policy enforcement team over at YouTube as a contractor, reviewing decisions made on videos. After about a year of that, I decided to move over to Patreon, where I've been ever since for the last 3.5 years working on the trust and safety content moderation team.
So because both Anastasia and I had this experience as contractors in outsourcing companies, and we have now the experience opposite at Patreon, where we manage an exclusive full-time employee team. We first got interested in this project, in this topic, because we feel that we have a few things to say about it. So what we'd like to discuss today, after going a little bit deeper on our experience as contractors, is to focus not only on the business angle and advantages of outsourcing, but also speak to the human cost of it. So what we'd like to suggest you do in the next minutes is to reflect on the advantages and disadvantages of going for outsourcing as a solution for your own business. So following our intro, what I would like to discuss in this section is my experience as a contractor. And I would like to focus on two particular aspects. The first thing I would like to highlight is culture. Usually tech companies have a philosophy, a voice that they expect to be transmitted by their customer service anywhere. This should reflect in a common voice across all teams. However, if you're outsourcing this culture, it will not be transmitted the same way. Because outsourcing companies compete with each other to get clients, they define their own culture. From my experience, this culture will be based on quantity over quality. This also will exercise a lot of pressure in the teammates, since these numbers are usually directly related to salaries. And a productivity mindset is usually what's fostered and does not translate in the quality of the interactions that the business usually idolizes. So my advice here would be to focus on reciprocity. In a quality standards logic, if you want your creators, customers, users to be treated kindly and fairly, we should start by offering the same conditions to your representatives. Which leads me to the second point, which would be engagement. So how can we be successful? We need to have a highly committed team, right? Because of the quantity over quality logic that usually dominates this model of business, the level of engagement and availability to think outside the box and bring innovation to the company and positive changes usually has no place. And teammates that have this mindset and are usually committed and talented will feel unmotivated for the lack of recognition in the organization they are part of. So the mindset will really be reproduction and never innovation, which will oppress potential talent. From my experience, people working in outsourcing companies often feel undermined and inferior to their peers in insourcing doing the same job, which leads to feelings of resentment and finally has consequences in terms of mental health for the outsourced employees. So to summarize, I would like to say that the most common feeling that the people that you're going to have that working for you that might be actually very committed and talented will feel is that they'll feel a constant feeling of contradiction and injustice towards them because they won't be able to either respond to the demands of your company in terms of quality or the demands of the outsourced company in terms of volume.
Yeah, the points that you just pointed out, Mariana, I know that I've definitely experienced those same feelings of resentment during my time as a contractor at YouTube. And of course that it's not the best feeling in the world. So it was very interesting to kind of be on the other side of that coin. When I started at Patreon and we needed to essentially hire contractors at the time, given the resources and the limited budget that we were working with 3 years ago and a couple of years ago as well. So a couple of the things that I wanted to highlight for my section over here is the couple of times that we did work with contractor companies in both Honduras and in the Philippines. So a little bit of context on those situations to Patreon specifically. So the first time that we worked with an outsourcing company was in 2017 with a Honduran company. And at the time, I was just starting out. I was a third member of the trust and safety team. So it's not like we had all hands on deck at the time. And Patreon was growing super quickly at the moment. And of course, with such a small team internally, it was hard to cover all of our bases and making sure to keep the platform safe. This is when, leadership at the time decided, this is the best time to go ahead and start experimenting with outsourcing content moderation services. So in that role, I was essentially lead trainer, traveling to Honduras and to make sure that the contractor team really understood kind of the mission and of course, at the end of the day, our guidelines to make sure that they were doing the same high quality work that we were doing back at the headquarters in San Francisco. The second time that we've worked with an outsourcing content moderation work was working for about a year's time with a company based in the Philippines. This came as a result of a little bit more increased attention in terms of Patreon, specifically to adult content. So at the time, we needed, a little bit more eyes on this particular content type within our platform. So we commissioned an outsourcing group to make sure that we were actually communicating with the creators one-on-one, because that was something that we absolutely wanted to keep. We weren't ready to sacrifice the very human-led, very human review process at the time in working and guaranteeing that every single creator or our users was speaking with a human at the other side of the screen. So that was something that we really valued at the time. And again, similar to the first time that we worked with a contractor company, we had very limited headcount and budget to work with. So we decided that this was the best decision to make at that time. So based on my personal experience with working with these two instances, of course, I noticed a bunch of business advantages and disadvantages, but also I want to go into a little bit deeper with the human side of things with the advantages and disadvantages as well. But starting off, of course, I think everyone knows that in terms of, when you have a limited budget to work with, the first benefit of on the business side into hiring a content moderation service in outsourcing is cost efficiency. I think that's no secret to anyone. I think the second thing that I've noticed was a huge benefit was to ensure that we had worldwide coverage with our users. And it was really a great chance to start working into having an international team and ensuring the faster response times to creators. Yeah, so when it comes to, the benefits and the advantages, at least on the human side, I think the one thing that really resonates and, is kind of like the light at the end of the tunnel is that at the end of the day, you're giving people a salary. That's a huge benefit, of course, to the company that you're working with to provide those local opportunities for those in other countries, essentially, if that's the route that you want to go. The second thing that I've noticed is that you might be giving the full-time employee, or whether that be yourself or someone on your team, you're giving them a great opportunity to learn how to communicate and to manage those vendors, those partners, to hone their kind of leadership and also to hone their communication skills at the end of the day. I'm thinking specifically for roles involving training, of course, to train on the policies, train on the guidelines, but also on the flip side of that coin, to make sure that your quality analysts have an opportunity to work with an international team as well. And of course, to increase the level of kind of cross-cultural communication. And lastly, I think the biggest benefit, at least on the human side, is that you get to hear a different perspective on your day-to-day workflows that you might not have had the opportunity or the luxury to have in the past. Although I do want to say that this can lead to a little bit of resistance between your full-time employees and contractors, at least based on my experience, but we'll go into the disadvantages in a quick second. So going a little bit more into detail about the business disadvantages into choosing to outsource content moderation services for your team and for your company. So of course, the first being that contractor companies control the messaging around your partnership. And sometimes this might pose a brand risk to your company that at the end of the day can lead to a little bit of media criticism. And of course, thinking about specifically the times that you see those articles about Facebook hiring 30,000 content moderators and all of them leading to be outsourced, of course. But yeah, no, that's the first thing that I've noticed. And I think the second thing is that contractor companies might impose a higher output standard than what you tell them what you want. So as Mariana mentioned earlier, these outsourcing companies, they want to compete with others. So they want to show that they can process large volumes to other prospective customers. And unfortunately, this ultimately leads to a sacrifice in quality, as Mariana mentioned. So in the end, you might not have control over the messages that, the work that contractors have in working with your customers. So there's no consistency in that area because these competitive numbers ultimately come at the sacrifice of human health. And temporarily partnering with a contractor company can give the wrong impression to full-time employees. And to expand on this a little bit more, you have two groups of people doing very similar work. So you might get questions within your company saying, hey, well, why can't the full-time employees produce as much as the contractors? So that's something you should definitely keep in mind in making sure that there's a healthy dynamic and a healthy demand when it comes to managing the output of both teams, both internal teams and external teams. And kind of to expand a little bit more about what Mariana mentioned earlier is that you can't control how those outsourcing companies function because they do want to do business their way. They're their own company. So if they decide that professional growth on their teams is not a priority, then you have very little leeway in deciding the fate of the contractors that you hire. And this very important aspect of your relationship and your partnership is something that you have to consider, because at the end of the day, you know, are you able to sleep at night by making this kind of decision? And lastly, like as an aside, is that you don't know how much of the check that you're writing to this contractor company ultimately lands in the pockets of those contractors. You might be partnering with a company that doesn't value their employees financially, and unfortunately perpetuates a cycle of recycling people and recycling talent, and going into the whole reproduction rather than innovation comment that Mariana made earlier. And thinking about the kind of more human disadvantages to going with an outsourcing company for your work, is that generally most of the outsourcing work is temporary in nature. This can lead to a couple of things. First of all, what is the mental health impact of that team? You know, contractors might not be guaranteed the same working conditions. And of course, this can lead to bad quality of work. In general, worse quality of life for the individual at the other side of that screen. And the second thing here is that there's no professional growth, of course, if that's something that's not valued. They're working on most likely the most basic work that your team does that might not necessarily amplify or hone their skills, or give them an opportunity to upskill in the first place. So again, this perpetuation of a never-ending recycling of people without professional growth or career development is something that you should absolutely keep in mind. Reputationally speaking, the division of work also imposes an arbitrary hierarchy within your team, and can lead to resentment between both full-time employees and contractors, and generally a resentment towards your company at large if they don't feel like their work is being valued. And again, kind of the comments around perpetuating the replaceability of your team. You know, at the end of the day, if you outsource, you are sending a very subtle message, maybe not so subtle sometimes, that your work can be done by others, which discredits, you know, potentially your desire to find and keep the best talent on your team. So this might have effects on your full-time team and kind of the way that, you know, other teammates at your company might perceive your team as well. And of course, you know, just with all of this in mind, I think the biggest theme here is the social responsibility of choosing to outsource content moderation services is something that is ultimately what you have to keep in mind.
So following on the framework about on the advantages and disadvantages of outsourcing your company's work, would like to go a little deeper on the work that we do on the content moderation team at Patreon, and discuss why our team is successful and how we care for our team's well-being and how does this translate in good results.
Yeah, so I went into a little bit of detail about, you know, our time working with teams in both Honduras and in the Philippines, but kind of, you know, to focus on the nature of the times that we did that and kind of describe our experiences here. So the first, you know, being that partner managing is a very stressful job for your full-time employee who's on this project. The on-call nature of this work is very stressful and can impact the engagement of your full-time employee working with the contractor team here. The time zone changes can also pose a few challenges. There's, you know, sometimes there might be a lack of expertise on the contractor team to be able to respond to urgent or sensitive issues. You know, so this can ultimately lead to escalations that went unanswered for too many hours than we would like, or that they should have been. And if escalation response is a task or responsibility that's usually sequestered to full-time employees at your headquarters, then you might even be damaging other relationships with payment partners or your company's internal communications team, since you can't get back with an answer right away. So definitely keep that in mind. And is kind of a result from that, you know, time zone expectations. If your company is known to exist within a particular geographical boundary, you're an American company, for example, it might be strange for your customers to receive responses from the contractor teams that are outside of, you know, your typical business hours, which might something that your customers will definitely notice. So switching gears here and kind of switching it up and seeing how it's worked with Patreon in terms of hiring a full-time employee team internationally. The two locations that we went with are, of course, with Omaha and our Porto team, where Mariana is based. So the first thing that we wanted to do in terms of achieving goals, first of all, we wanted to ensure that we had a 16-hour business hour time coverage. So we had a little bit of a time zone expansion on the team and being able to respond to our customers, since that's something that they were really looking for, especially when it came to their questions about their earnings, which is, as we mentioned before, a huge part of Patreon's work here, and of course our team's work at the end of the day. So taking a look at that, we're able to hire talent with a lower budget than in San Francisco. As you can imagine, salaries in San Francisco are a little bit higher than in other places around the world, for reasons outside of our control. But, taking that into account, we were able to take a look at other countries, other states, where we thought we could still extend the same conditions and same culture that we had at the headquarters and still be able to successfully translate that to other offices at our company. So speaking in terms of specifically about Portugal, when we first considered expanding into Portugal, we were very specific and, again, intentional in what we wanted the team to look like and what the work would look like that they would be responsible for. So I don't know if everyone's aware, but Amazon and Airbnb do have a presence in Porto. So access to talent wasn't an issue. We knew that we could find people that would probably very much closely align with our mission, and have the skill set to be able to do the work that we do. So excuse me. So the FTEs that we hired in Portugal eventually held the same kind of enthusiasm for our mission and company the same way that people at the headquarters did, because we did consider them full-time employees. And the level of commitment that we were looking for would not be possible if these teammates were not exposed to that same culture and given those same opportunities as full-time employees. Also in terms of salary fairness and benefits, including equity at the end of the day. So by choosing to increase our full-time team and by enforcing these very high standards, not going to lie, this resulted in teammates in becoming more enthusiastic members of the team itself. And at the end of the day, they deliver a consistent voice in speaking with the customers, with the creators, that is very much in tune with Patreon's mission to fund the creative class. So one of the things is voice is a largely neglected part of the business. Voice and tone, this has to be communicated correctly by any customer-facing team at your company. Voice is often neglected. So a consistent voice, across the team will determine the way that your customers are treated and the way that your customers perceive your company at the end of the day. Ultimately, it's the deciding factor that they will take into account of whether they want to keep doing business with your company.
To conclude our session, we would like to leave you with a few things to think about before going for outsourcing as a solution for your team's work, and revisit some of the points that we discussed earlier. So the first thing to consider will be the human cost for both the contractor and the full-time employees teams working on this relationship. The first consequence of this type of business and type of work is the mental health impact, since this is a very high pressure environment and of temporary nature. This also translates to no concern for the care for the contractor's health. The second point to consider is the quality of the work. This is a very, very big trade-off. Because contracted companies have different metrics for their teams, they also have different incentives and goals that might not align with the values that you want to promote in your company.
The third thing that you should consider is the replaceability of your team. If your team is segmented into separate specific tasks, then outsourcing might just work for you. But if your entire team largely does very similar or the same task, then defining the work as replaceable by choosing to go with an outsourcing company can be detrimental. In trust and safety, your team's work is not replaceable. So be sure not to discredit the work that the team does and setting the right expectation internally within your company that anyone can do this work, because that's not the case.
So in regards to the content moderation team at Patreon, having a full-time employee team is what we found to work. We have been very lucky and intentional in finding talented teammates who will be dedicated to the mission and values of our company to fund the creative class. By guaranteeing the same working conditions and expectations, we aim to keep this group of talented individuals and grow with them. With all of this being said, thank you so much for tuning in to our session. I'll be available for Q&A right after this recording is finished. And have a great rest of your day, everyone.
Bye.